My mother-in-law and I were both pregnant. But she was obsessed with copying everything about me. Then our babies were born on the same day. She switched our babies in the hospital. She thought I was raising her child while she was raising mine. What she didn't know was that I had already switched the babies back. The child she was abusing was actually her own. After I married Charles, my father-in-law also married a woman. This woman became my mother-in-law, only 5 years older than me. Initially, I thought we wouldn't have much interaction. But I discovered she was like a copycat, imitating everything about me. From my mannerisms to my fashion style, even my daily routines. She copied everything. Several times, she dressed so similarly to me that Charles mistook her for me. Both Charles and I felt frustrated, so we moved out of the mansion into our previously purchased penthouse apartment. It worked out well since I was pregnant, and as an expectant mother, managing my stress levels was a priority. After moving out, I thought I'd escaped my annoying mother-in-law, but I hadn't. She sent me several messages, and when she noticed I rarely replied, she started asking about me in the family group chat, pretending to care. It wasn't until near my due date that I discovered she had registered at the same hospital as me. She kept asking about my baby's gender, my due date, and monitoring my health condition. I kept my responses vague. But that day still came, the day I gave birth. She also had a C-section and delivered a baby. I named my son Felix, and she named her Xavier. The naming issue made me angry because it wasn't enough that she copied me, now her son's name had to mirror my son's. And despite being from different generations, why did both names have to sound so similar? Charles, worried about me getting upset during my postpartum recovery, said, "Don't be angry. While the little one is too young to know, we can always change his name without telling them." His sneaky suggestion made me laugh. Then we started brainstorming other names that could symbolize our son's bright future. The children grew day by day. I quit my job to focus on childcare while Charles worked hard to support the family. I gave my baby the best of everything, and after 6 months, he was chubby and healthy. At the hospital check-up, the doctor said he was actually overnourished and needed some dietary control. I took him to a family gathering. There, I saw my in-laws whom I hadn't contacted for nearly 6 months, and their 6-month-old son who was alarmingly thin. When my father-in-law asked to hold Felix, I handed him over, then frowned as I looked at the skinny baby lying alone in the car seat. "Why is Xavier so thin? Have you taken him to the doctor? Could he be malnourished?" My mother-in-law was smiling while playing with my baby. "It's fine, thin babies are easier to raise. All babies used to be skinny. Your Felix is well fed and pampered, while our Xavier is being raised the old-fashioned way. He'll turn out fine." I looked at her disapprovingly, but she avoided my gaze, doting on Felix as if he were her own son. With concern, I picked up Xavier and asked, "Has he been fed?" "Let me make him some formula, I brought plenty with me." My mother-in-law continued playing with Felix, completely ignoring me. My father-in-law looked over and said, "Sure, feed him. I haven't seen him eat all day." My heart sank. Suppressing my anger, I prepared a bottle and carefully fed him. Xavier was so small, feeling incredibly light in my arms. He didn't fuss at all, just quietly drank the formula in big gulps, as if he hadn't eaten in a long time. He was surprisingly well behaved, not making any fuss unlike Felix, who often cried loudly. Back home, Charles was playing with the baby while I researched on my laptop. I could hear them laughing like ducks together. "Charles, why don't you give him a bath? Let's get him to bed early tonight." Charles stroked Felix's sweaty hair. "All right, I'll take him for his bath. Don't work too late, come to bed soon." I smiled softly at him. "Don't worry, I'll be up shortly." As I watched Charles take the baby upstairs, the smile faded from my face. Just as I finished reviewing the documents and was about to head up for bed, my phone rang. It was the nanny I had placed in my mother-in-law's house. "Ma'am, you wanted to speak with me?" Yes, I wanted to ask, how does my mother-in-law treat the baby? She seems very attentive, plays with him daily, and buys him lots of toys. But why is he so small and thin? He doesn't look healthy. Could it be his constitution? Your mother-in-law holds him constantly and insists on doing everything herself. She always feeds him alone in her room and won't let anyone else help with bathing him. Oh, I responded. Keep watching and let me know if you notice anything else. Yes, but there is one concerning thing I've noticed. My interest piqued. What's that? Your mother-in-law has been contacting various insurance companies, apparently looking to get policies for the whole family. My fingers stopped drumming on the coffee table. Insurance? Didn't she receive a large settlement after her previous husband's death? Yes, that's what our investigation found. All right, keep watching and report anything unusual. After hanging up, I reopened my laptop to review what we'd found about my mother-in-law. Helen, 29, from Boston. She'd been married before, but her husband died in a car accident, leaving her with a substantial insurance payout. Afterward, she frequented upscale venues where she met my father-in-law during his national business trip. They claimed it was love at first sight, married quickly due to pregnancy. When I first heard about their marriage, I had her investigated, though nothing particularly suspicious came up. Still, I felt uneasy and kept someone watching her. Especially after I noticed her obsessive copying of me. Though I didn't know her intentions, having her watched proved to be the right decision. Thankfully, because of these precautions, I knew immediately when she switched the babies after birth. Both the nanny and the nurse I had placed with Helen helped switch the babies back. Still worried, I had a DNA test done with Felix to confirm he was really my child. I never told Charles about any of this, because he's terrible at acting. He'd give everything away in a heartbeat. Honey, Felix is crying for you, hurry. He's about to cry himself sick. Coming. I closed my laptop and went upstairs. After getting Felix to sleep, Charles snuggled up next to me. Darling, I have something to report. I looked at him puzzled. What's with the formal language? Since when do you report things? He respectfully held out his phone with both hands. I took it, confused. On the screen was a message from his stepmother. Charles, why don't you and Rachel bring the baby over for dinner this weekend? Your father says he misses his grandson and wants to see more of him. I questioned, why did she text you instead of me? She knows you're busy with work while I'm at home. Charles sighed, I think she's trying to flirt with me. I knew my stepmother wasn't simple, and look at her message, it doesn't make any sense. What doesn't make sense? Charles, seeing Felix asleep in my arms, took him from me. Dad just saw us today and complained that Felix was too fussy after holding him for 2 minutes. Why would he suddenly want to see more of him? I bet Helen is up to something. Dad must be blinded by love and she's using him. I secretly smiled, thinking how ironic it was for him to call his father lovesick when he was just as bad himself. So, Charles whispered, there must be some trick here. He added angrily, I don't know how she managed to bewitch my father, but it was his choice to marry her, so we can't interfere. My only worry is that if this stepmother turns out to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, we're in trouble. We've let the fox into the henhouse. I remained calm hearing this. Probably because everything was under my control. Don't worry, I'll keep watching. As for your father, though he's lovesick, he's still rational and much smarter than you, trust me. Charles rested his head on my shoulder. I'm so lucky to have you, honey. You solve so many problems for me. I kissed his forehead. You just focus on making money. I'll handle everything else. Since Helen said my father-in-law missed his grandson, I naturally took Felix to visit. The next day, I carried the baby back to the mansion. Helen rushed over immediately. Let me hold him. I smiled and handed Felix to her, then walked over to Xavier, who was lying alone in his stroller. His gaze remained eerily calm and vacant, an expression that should never appear on a baby just months old. In contrast, Felix was giggling at Helen's playful attention. My father-in-law came downstairs. "You're back? We're having king crab tonight. Is Charles coming?" I nodded, lifting Xavier from his stroller. I told him to leave work early and join us for dinner. Xavier was unnaturally well behaved, lying perfectly still against me. I discreetly pulled up his sleeve a bit but didn't notice anything unusual. At dinner time, Charles arrived with a dark expression. I hurried over to take his laptop. "What's wrong? Why the long face?" I stood on tiptoe to kiss his chin. "My assistant isn't following orders. I want to fire him." I smiled reassuringly. "He's just looking out for the company. Don't think I don't know about your slacking off. I actually asked that assistant to keep an eye on you and make sure you're working." Charles growled and playfully pushed me against the wall for a kiss. Catching Helen in my peripheral vision, I decided we'd shown enough affection and pinched Charles's waist. "Ouch, honey, that hurts." I pushed him away shyly. "Your stepmother is watching." Charles finally noticed Helen standing nearby. Helen smiled at us. "Come wash up for dinner." She turned away, but I didn't miss the flash of hostility in her eyes. From that day on, I told Charles to forward me any messages from Helen. Sure enough, she texted him consistently for a week. Most messages were about things she'd bought for Xavier, saying she'd gotten the same for Felix too. Charles would always just reply with a simple, "Thank you." She'd respond with cute emojis saying no need to thank me. Sometimes she'd ask what kind of soup Charles liked, saying she was learning to cook and would make it for him and his father. Looking through all the messages, I noticed she never mentioned me once. Her intentions were crystal clear. Charles had been spooked by her these past few days. That night, he curled up against me. "I'm scared. I don't want to talk to her anymore. I want to block her." I patted his shoulder. "Just hang in there. Charles, I don't know what you're planning, but I feel like you're setting up a trap." I pinched his nose. "Just play your part well." A few days later, I received a message from the nanny that Helen had contacted insurance agents to come and sell policies for my father-in-law. TSK. I picked up my phone and made a call. "Dad, do you know about Helen contacting insurance companies?" His voice came through. "Yes, I do." "And?" He chuckled on the other end. "Don't worry." I smiled. "What's your next move?" He chuckled again. "I won't do anything. Let her do what she wants. When she realizes it's all been for nothing, I just hope she doesn't have a breakdown." He sighed. "I knew choosing you as my daughter-in-law was my best decision ever. With you watching over Charles, I have nothing to worry about." "I'll take good care of Charles, but what about Xavier? What's going to happen to him?" "What do you mean?" "He's not my child. I have no obligation to raise him." I was shocked. So Xavier wasn't my father-in-law's child. No wonder he hadn't noticed how thin the baby was becoming. He never intended to get involved. Thinking of Xavier's frail condition, I felt a twinge of sympathy. Daughter-in-law, being soft-hearted isn't always good. No matter how clever your strategy, if your heart wavers, everything could fall apart. Small mercies can ruin bigger plans. I snapped back to reality. "I understand, Dad. Don't tell Charles about this. Managing the company is already pushing his limits. If he gets involved in this, I'm afraid he'll run the business into the ground." While that was true, surely Charles wasn't quite that useless? On the day Helen planned to buy insurance, my father-in-law called Charles and me over. Charles walked in looking confused. "Dad, why the sudden summons?" Helen came forward smiling, asking Charles, "Where's the baby?" She peered behind me as she spoke. "He's at home with the nanny." Charles then pulled me past her. An hour later, we sat on the couch while the insurance broker presented their products. "So why are we suddenly buying insurance?" Charles asked, puzzled. "Oh, it's just something everyone should have. I've been looking into this product for a while. It's quite good," Helen explained with a smile. Charles was about to question further when his father interrupted. "I think it's excellent. If anything unfortunate happens, the payout would provide for the family. Charles nearly jumped up, but I placed my hand on him. Charles, your father must have his reasons. I think this insurance is good too. Oh? You've looked into it? If you think it's good, then okay. The broker beamed. I've already prepared the paperwork. We just need signatures. I smiled as I took the documents, thanking him. Our policies were simple. Charles and I listed each other as beneficiaries. When Charles saw Helen listed as his father's beneficiary, he almost jumped up again. I patted his shoulder and shook my head. Charles looked confused once more. Back in the car, Charles couldn't hold back anymore. Honey, what are you up to? Her intentions are so obvious even an idiot could see them. Isn't she trying to harm Dad? This is straight out of a TV drama. I glanced at him, focusing on driving. If even an idiot can see it, then I certainly can too. Charles curled up in the passenger seat. So you're setting another trap, and this time Dad's the bait, right? What a goofball. I laughed. Right, you're both bait. But what if she actually hurts Dad? I sighed. If you can see through your stepmother's intentions, don't you think your father can too? Don't worry, he'll be fine. Charles finally relaxed. Okay, but please don't let her hurt him. Don't worry. It wasn't until we got home that Charles suddenly exclaimed, so this means Dad isn't just a hopeless romantic after all. I rolled my eyes. You're the only hopeless romantic in your family. I saw Xavier again a month later. I visited the mansion while Helen was at the beauty salon. My heart ached seeing Xavier's even more vacant stare. He remained eerily quiet. The nanny brought me juice. Ma'am, I believe Helen is abusing the child. My heart jumped. So it was true? How did you discover this? Several times, I noticed his milk bottles were cold, likely made with cold water. Once, after his bath, when Helen rushed to answer a phone call, I held him briefly. He was shivering and ice cold. She probably bathed him in cold water. My hand trembled, holding the juice glass. Also, I accidentally discovered bruises on his thighs, like someone had pinched him. I set down my glass and examined Xavier's clothes. While his legs seemed fine, I found several scars on his back that looked like cigarette burns. Helen had been burning him with cigarettes. My heart raced. Then it hit me. Helen thought Xavier was my child, and she was always exceptionally affectionate with Felix. She was trying to hurt who she thought was my child. I fixed his clothes and gently touched his cheek. I needed to be patient a little longer. Xavier looked at me, suddenly reaching out to grab my clothes. In my arms, his vacant expression disappeared, replaced by one of distress. Then his tears began falling. Suddenly, he spoke, Mama. The nanny and I froze. He's never spoken before, he's only a few months old. He continued crying softly, still not making a fuss. I held him tenderly, patting his back. There. I handed him back to the nanny. Is my father-in-law home? In his study upstairs. I went up and knocked. Come in. Dad. He beckoned me over. Come look at this. On his computer screen was security footage showing Helen with a mechanic working on his car. Aren't they being a bit obvious? He chuckled. Obvious or not, it works. She's tried several times to get me to go traveling, swimming, hiking. I refused everything. When she ran out of options, I suggested I might go racing with friends. That's when she thought of tampering with the car. Did you need something? I remembered Xavier. Did you know Helen was abusing Xavier? He paused, surprised by my question. Generally, yes. Didn't you want to save him? He crossed his arms on his desk. I understand your concern and your soft heart, but how can we save him without getting enough leverage against Helen? That's partly why I accelerated the plan. Resolving this quickly is best for everyone. You may be tougher than Charles, but you're both equally kind-hearted. Seeing my silence, he continued, the child is weak now, but I have a doctor check him monthly, nothing too serious. Once we deal with Helen, you can decide what to do with him. But I won't raise him. I nodded. I understand. I'll handle it then. He gave me all the evidence and surveillance footage. You know what to do. Wait for my signal next week. When I left the mansion, I didn't expect that the next time I heard from my father-in-law, he'd be in the hospital. My heart sank when I got the news, worried something serious had happened. I rushed to the hospital with Charles and found his father in bed. Dad, what happened? How did you break your leg out of nowhere? Charles was beside himself with worry. His father reassured him, it's nothing serious, just a fractured ankle. Rest will fix it. Helen was peeling an apple by the bed, looking uncomfortable. I caught my father-in-law's subtle glance and gave him a slight nod. Helen, since you need to focus on caring for Dad, why don't I take Xavier to stay with us? You can concentrate on the hospital. Helen shook her head, I can make time to care for him. But my father-in-law interrupted, don't run back and forth. I don't want Charles and Rachel coming to the hospital often either. Just stay here and take care of me. Let them take the baby, they have experience with Felix. I want you by my side while I recover. Hearing this, Helen couldn't object, maintaining her innocent facade. After bringing Xavier home from the mansion, I compared him to Felix. He was significantly smaller. Felix happily tugged at Xavier's pants, giggling loudly. Xavier's expression changed from cold detachment to resignation as Felix drooled all over his face. Watching them play, I finally felt relieved. Next step, dealing with Helen. I prepared all the evidence at home. This included proof of Helen tampering with the car, causing the accident and her child abuse. Just as I was about to brief Charles, I got a call from the hospital. My father-in-law had fallen down the hospital stairs. I knew immediately Helen was behind it. Since the car accident hadn't finished him off, was this plan B? Too bad she didn't know he'd practiced martial arts for over a decade in his youth. A fall downstairs was amateur hour. When I arrived at the hospital, he was casually eating noodles. Where's Helen? Police took her. What? After being admitted, I noticed the hospital's lack of surveillance, so I donated some tiny cameras for the stairwell corners. Today, when I asked Helen to help me walk, she pushed me down the stairs. Caught her in the act. With my second fracture, I called the police immediately. Some officers will come for statements soon. You know what to say. I nodded vigorously, this was definitely my specialty. After the police arrived, my father-in-law described how he was pushed down the stairs. The security footage will show everything. She tried to murder me. After his statement, I raised my hand. Officers, I suspect she was also involved in his recent car accident. I have evidence at home that I can bring to the station. I delivered all the materials and surveillance footage to the police station. When Charles picked me up, he was in shock. Especially hearing the word murder, it gave him cold sweats. Back home, I realized he was angry, seriously angry. What's wrong? You and Dad kept me in the dark about something this dangerous? I swallowed, it wasn't that dangerous. I saw the footage. She literally shoved him down the stairs. If he hadn't known martial arts, he could have cracked his skull open. I fell silent, it was serious indeed. The footage had shocked me too. Charles sipped his juice and pointed to the sofa. Sit. Confess everything. Smiling apologetically, I explained everything from the beginning. When Charles and I first met Helen, it was 3 days after she and his father had registered their marriage. They claimed they met while traveling and married immediately before coming home. I hadn't thought much of it until she started copying me obsessively, which made me uncomfortable and suspicious. I had her investigated and found nothing particularly alarming, except that she'd been married before. Her previous husband died in an accident, leaving her with a $500,000 insurance payout. After we moved out, I thought we could avoid contact. But seeing Xavier changed my mind. Suspecting child abuse, I discussed it with my father-in-law. The conversation was eye-opening. He'd investigated her before marriage and suspected she was involved in her previous husband's death. She came claiming she was pregnant with my child. Ridiculous, I wasn't even drunk that night, just pretending to avoid drinking. I know exactly what didn't happen. But if she wanted to con me, I'd let her leave with something. Those were his exact words. Charles's eyes widened, so what Dad wanted her to leave with was the $5 million compensation. First, my father-in-law had lawyers draw up documents transferring his properties to Charles and most of his savings to my account. When I'd asked why he transferred so much money to me, he just said to hold on to it. Only then did he marry Helen. His pre-marriage assets were essentially zero. Helen discovered after marriage that my father-in-law had virtually no assets. The house and car belonged to Charles. But it was too late to back out, and she'd been playing the role of a wealthy woman herself. To show commitment, her $500,000 became marital property. Under these circumstances, she wouldn't want a divorce. She'd lose money by having to split her funds with him. So she decided to try her old trick, collect insurance money and run. That's why she arranged insurance policies for everyone, making herself my father-in-law's beneficiary. He drove the tampered car to an empty area and crashed into a tree, only breaking his leg. Did he have to take such a risk? Charles's face darkened. Of course, we needed solid evidence of attempted murder. That's the only way to resolve this permanently. When Helen saw he survived, she watched him constantly at the hospital, waiting for another chance. Her second attempt was caught on camera. The attempted murder charge was now ironclad. When I saw Helen again, she'd lost weight. "Why are you the one visiting?" she asked, puzzled. I placed a stack of documents before her. "This is a gift agreement transferring your assets to Xavier. This changes the insurance beneficiary from you to Charles. And this is the divorce agreement, already signed by my father-in-law." Helen smiled. "What are you dreaming about? Why would I sign these? Besides..." Her eyes gleamed with malice. "You've seen his injuries by now, haven't you? The burns, the bruises, I did those." I handed her a medical report: burns, needle marks, a healed fracture in his right foot, chronic cold water baths, cold formula, all causing severe digestive issues. "Helen, I can't understand how you could do this to such a small child." She laughed gleefully. "So what if I hurt him? He's not even my son." "Rachel, why? Just because I'm 5 years older, why do you get everything while I get nothing? Why do you get a wealthy husband while I have to marry a 50-year-old man? The world isn't fair, so I had to make you suffer too. Why should your life be perfect?" I finally understood why she switched the babies, not to give one a better life, but to hurt me by hurting a child. How could jealousy drive someone to such extremes? Seeing my silence, she laughed harder. "Surprise, Rachel. Xavier isn't my son, Felix is. You've been raising my son while I've been torturing yours. Your son suffered for months under my care, and you didn't even know which was yours. What a failure you are." I pushed the gift agreement forward again. "Just sign these. If you do, I'll have my father-in-law write a letter of forgiveness. It might reduce your sentence." Helen drummed her fingers on the table. "Fine, but I want to change it, give everything to Felix, my real son." "But..." She smirked. "I'm surprised how cold you are. Learning your child was abused doesn't seem to affect you at all. How disappointing. I had the lawyer leave to print new agreements. You did all this out of jealousy. Don't you find that pathetic?" Helen shrugged. "What's pathetic? I just didn't expect your father-in-law wasn't really love-struck, acting all devoted but outplaying me in the end. And you, looking so soft but having a heart of stone. I still don't get it. What makes you worthy of Charles? Why do you get such a good life without even working? Sign everything, and I'll tell you." After she signed, I packed up the documents. "Tell me. Why?" I sent the lawyer away and stood up. I married him because I funded his family's company, $50 million. He stays loyal because he's hopelessly romantic. And I have one more piece of information you might find interesting. She leaned back, sneering, so it was money after all. Your love isn't so pure either. What else? I took out the DNA test from my coat pocket and placed it before her. Felix is my son. Xavier is yours. After you switched them, I switched them back immediately. You've been torturing your own child all along. The color drained from her face. I watched as she picked up the test results with trembling hands. A minute later, she broke down sobbing. I turned and walked away. Helen was sentenced to 20 years. Despite my father-in-law's letter of forgiveness, since it was a criminal case involving attempted murder, her sentence remained largely unchanged. As for her previous husband's death, too many years had passed to investigate. I adopted Xavier, and within 6 months, he became healthy and chubby. Helen was beautiful, and Xavier took after her. He was an exceptionally handsome child, even more striking than Felix. Unfortunately, the early abuse had weakened his constitution, but we were doing our best to help him recover. Since coming to live with us, he became incredibly attached to me, wanting to stay by my side constantly. Sometimes this made Felix jealous. Whenever Xavier noticed Felix's jealousy, he would quietly shuffle away to play with his toys alone, being impossibly well behaved. I've always felt guilty that I couldn't protect him earlier. Charles comforted me. Helen kept Xavier with her 24 hours a day. You couldn't have saved him earlier even if you wanted to. This is the best possible outcome, and it's permanent. Indeed, this was the best solution I could have managed. From now on, I will always treat Xavier as my own son. My father-in-law was getting married again, and this time he informed Charles and me. We drove straight to the mansion, and I was stunned to see his bride-to-be. It was Zhao Yu, the nanny I had placed to watch Helen. My father-in-law knew her identity, and she had been reporting Helen's activities to him. Somehow, they ended up falling in love. Zhao Yu was an excellent cook and had a gentle, kind nature. My father-in-law was completely smitten. So it turned out there were 2 hopeless romantics in the Zhou family. Looking down at Felix, who was holding Xavier's hand and grinning foolishly, I felt a headache coming on. Please don't tell me Felix would be a hopeless romantic too.